Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. The respected gentleman dies beneath his beloved cherry trees. The village mourns. The doctor hesitates. Miss Marple watches and remembers. You see, dear listener, the most dangerous crimes often wear the prettiest disguises. A teacup of poison looks identical to one of tea. A grieving niece may hide a murderous heart. And cherry blossoms fall beautifully whether they witness innocence or guilt. Where are you listening from this evening? Perhaps you sit by your own window watching spring arrive or autumn fade. Wherever you are, settle in comfortably. Let the world outside wait a moment longer. Miss Marple invites you to observe alongside her, to notice what others miss, and to remember that human nature, in all its flawed complexity, reveals itself in the smallest gestures and quietest moments. Chapter 1. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the cherry trees. Pink petals drifted down like gentle snow across the lawn of Colonel Ashford's estate. White tables stood arranged in careful rows, each laden with sandwiches, cakes, and silver teapots. St. Mary Mead had gathered for the annual spring garden party. Ladies wore their finest hats. Gentlemen carried walking sticks they did not need. Children chased each other between the trees while their mothers called out warnings about grass stains. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table beneath a particularly lovely cherry tree. She wore a soft grey dress and a cameo brooch. Her knitting bag rested beside her chair. She appeared to focus on her teacup, but her bright eyes missed nothing. Colonel Edward Ashford moved among his guests with practised ease. He was a tall man in his 70s with a military bearing and kind eyes. His niece Clara followed a few steps behind, greeting villagers with polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Clara Ashford had arrived from London 3 weeks earlier. She told everyone her visit was simply to enjoy the countryside. The village gossip suggested otherwise. They whispered about financial troubles and broken engagements. Miss Marple observed Clara's hands as she poured tea for Mrs. Price Ridley. They trembled slightly, causing the cup to rattle against the saucer. Mrs. Price Ridley did not notice. She rarely noticed anything beyond her own concerns. Dr. Haydock approached the Colonel near the refreshment table. The two men spoke in low tones. Miss Marple watched the Colonel's expression shift from pleasant to grave. Dr. Haydock placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. The vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, dropped into the chair beside Miss Marple. She carried a plate piled high with cucumber sandwiches and lemon cake. Griselda believed in enjoying life's pleasures without apology. She said, "Clara looks rather pale today." Miss Marple nodded gently. "London life can be quite draining." Griselda lowered her voice. "Mrs. Bantry told me Clara left the city rather suddenly. Something about debts." Miss Marple made a soft sound that could mean anything. People often left cities for many reasons. Debts were common among young people living beyond their means. A messenger boy arrived on a bicycle, startling several guests. He carried a telegram envelope. Colonel Ashford accepted it with visible reluctance. He tore it open, read quickly, and his face paled. The Colonel excused himself and walked toward the house. Clara watched him go. Her expression shifted from anxiety to something harder to name. Miss Marple recognized it from a case years ago involving a greengrocer's nephew. It was calculation. The party continued around them. Villagers praised the blossoms and the weather. The vicar discussed his Sunday sermon with anyone who would listen. Children laughed and played. Cherry petals continued their gentle descent. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She had learned over many years that gardens revealed truths. They showed who tended them with care and who walked through them carrying secrets. She watched Clara's eyes follow her uncle's path toward the house. Griselda bit into a sandwich. She said, "These are divine." Clara must have supervised the kitchen. She has quite refined tastes. Miss Marple considered this. Refined tastes often required refined resources. She wondered what Clara would do if those resources disappeared. The Colonel returned after 20 minutes. He smiled and chatted, but the warmth had left his eyes. He stood straighter, as if bracing against an invisible weight. Miss Marple noticed he avoided looking at Clara. The afternoon progressed toward evening. Shadows lengthened beneath the cherry trees. Guests began gathering their things and making their farewells. The Colonel thanked each person individually, shaking hands and accepting compliments. Clara stood beside him, playing the dutiful niece. She handed out small sachets of dried lavender as parting gifts. Her hands no longer trembled. She had regained her composure, wrapped it around herself like armor. Miss Marple approached to offer her thanks. She said, "What a lovely party, Colonel. Your cherry trees are magnificent this year." The Colonel's smile warmed slightly. He said, "Thank you, Miss Marple." "Nature provides her own entertainment." Miss Marple glanced at Clara. She said, "You must be proud to have family visiting." The Colonel's smile faded. He said, "Yes, family is important," Clara interjected smoothly. She said, "Uncle Edward has been so generous." "I cannot imagine living anywhere else now." Miss Marple noted the possessive tone. She noted the Colonel's slight wince. She thanked them again and made her way home through the village lanes. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting. The light faded outside her window. She thought about trembling hands and sudden telegrams. She thought about refined tastes and desperate situations. Her housemaid, Mary, brought in the evening tea. She said, "Did you enjoy the party, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple nodded. She said, "Very much, though I suspect the Colonel has troubles weighing on him." Mary settled into gossip eagerly. She said, "Cook heard from the Ashford kitchen that Miss Clara and the Colonel had words last week." Quite heated words. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She asked about what matter. Mary shrugged. She said, "Money most like. It is always money with London folk." Miss Marple considered this. Money troubles drove people to desperate measures. She had seen it countless times across her long life. A shopkeeper who embezzled, a housemaid who stole, a nephew who forged cheques. She asked, "Has Clara been to the chemist recently?" Mary thought for a moment. She said, "Now that you mention it, yes." Mr. Parminter mentioned she bought some medicine for the Colonel's heart. Miss Marple's needles paused. She said, "I did not know the Colonel had heart trouble." Mary said, "Neither did I. He seems quite robust for his age." Miss Marple resumed knitting. Her mind worked through possibilities like fingers through yarn. Heart medicine could mean many things. Some helped, some harmed, depending on the dose and the intent. The evening deepened into night. Miss Marple sat by her window watching the stars emerge. She thought about cherry blossoms falling, beautiful and brief. She thought about how quickly spring could turn to winter. In the distance, lights glowed in the windows of the Ashford house. Miss Marple wondered what conversations happened behind those curtains. She wondered if Clara slept peacefully or if guilt already gnawed at her conscience. Gardens revealed truths, but only to those who watched carefully. Miss Marple had watched carefully for 7 decades. She recognized the signs of trouble, like a gardener recognizes weeds among the flowers. She finished her tea and set the cup aside. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. She could only observe and remember. Human nature repeated itself endlessly, wearing different faces but following familiar patterns. Chapter 2. Dawn broke cold and grey over St. Mary Mead. Mist clung to the ground like a damp blanket. Birds sang their morning songs, but the world felt muted, as if holding its breath. Miss Marple rose at her usual early hour. She washed and dressed in a simple blue frock. She pinned her cameo brooch at her collar. Routine provided comfort, especially when the world outside grew uncertain. Mary arrived in the kitchen looking flustered. Her cap sat askew. Her eyes were wide with shock. She clutched her apron with trembling fingers. She said, "Miss Marple, terrible news. The Colonel is dead." Miss Marple steadied herself against the table. She asked, "When?" Mary gulped air. She said, "They found him this morning beneath his cherry trees. Dr. Haydock is there now." Miss Marple gathered her shawl and walking stick. She moved with purpose toward the Ashford estate. Other villagers were already heading in the same direction. News travelled fast in St. Mary Mead. The Colonel lay beneath his favourite tree. Pink petals covered his coat like a burial shroud. His eyes were closed peacefully. A teacup rested on the ground beside him, its contents spilled into the grass. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body. He checked for vital signs, though clearly none remained. His face showed professional concern mixed with personal grief. The colonel had been his friend for 30 years. Inspector Slack arrived from the nearby town. He was a broad man with a skeptical expression. He believed village folk prone to hysteria and exaggeration. He approached with visible reluctance. He asked, "Natural causes?" Dr. Haydock hesitated. He said, "Possibly." The colonel was in good health, but men his age can succumb suddenly. Inspector Slack nodded, satisfied. He said, "Heart attack, then." Tragic, but not uncommon. Miss Marple stood at a respectful distance. She observed the scene carefully. The teacup caught her attention. Its pattern was delicate with blue forget-me-nots. She recognized it as part of Clara's personal tea set. Clara emerged from the house wrapped in a dark shawl. She looked pale but composed. She approached the body slowly, then stopped several feet away. Her expression showed more relief than grief. She said, "Poor Uncle Edward. He seemed well yesterday." Dr. Haydock stood and dusted off his trousers. He said, "Death comes when it will, Miss Ashford." "My condolences," Clara nodded. She said, "Thank you, Doctor. Should I make arrangements?" Inspector Slack waved a hand. He said, "We will need to complete formalities first." "Routine matters." Miss Marple approached Dr. Haydock quietly. She said, "A peaceful passing, it seems." Dr. Haydock met her eyes. He said, "On the surface, yes. But something troubles me." Miss Marple waited. She knew silence often encouraged confidences. He continued in a low voice. He said, "There is an odour, faint but distinctive. Bitter almonds." Miss Marple's expression did not change. She said, "How curious." Dr. Haydock glanced toward Inspector Slack. He said, "I may be imagining things. The mind plays tricks when losing a friend." Miss Marple said gently, "Your medical training does not imagine, Doctor. It observes." Dr. Haydock rubbed his face wearily. He said, "I should order a more thorough examination. But the village will talk. Clara will suffer needless scrutiny." Miss Marple considered the teacup again. She said, "Truth protects the innocent, Doctor." "Only the guilty fear examination?" Inspector Slack called out impatiently. He said, "Dr. Haydock, can you sign the certificate now?" "I have 3 other matters waiting." Dr. Haydock hesitated. Professional duty warred with personal loyalty. Miss Marple watched him struggle. She remembered a similar situation involving a banker who ignored evidence to protect a colleague's reputation. She said quietly, "The colonel deserves the truth, whatever it may be." Dr. Haydock straightened his shoulders. He said, "Inspector, I recommend an autopsy." "Something about the death seems irregular." Inspector Slack frowned. He said, "Irregular how?" Dr. Haydock said, "I detected an unusual odour that warrants investigation." Inspector Slack sighed heavily. He said, "Very well. More paperwork for everyone. Miss Ashford, the body will be transported to the county morgue." Clara's composure slipped briefly. She said, "Is that necessary?" "Uncle Edward would want a simple burial." Inspector Slack said, "Standard procedure now, miss." "Doctor's orders." Clara recovered quickly. She said, "Of course." "Whatever is proper." Miss Marple observed Clara's clenched hands. The knuckles showed white. Fear had replaced relief. Guilty people often made that progression when investigation threatened exposure. The body was removed on a stretcher. Villagers watched from respectful distances. They whispered among themselves. Miss Marple heard fragments of conversation. "Heart attack. So sudden." "Poor Clara." Miss Marple approached the teacup. She knelt with difficulty, her old knees protesting. She studied it without touching. The blue forget-me-nots seemed to mock their name. This cup would not be forgotten. Dr. Haydock joined her. He said, "You recognize it?" Miss Marple said, "Clara's personal set. A gift from her late mother, I believe." Dr. Haydock said the colonel had his own preference in china. He rarely used anything else. Miss Marple rose carefully. She said, "Then one wonders why he drank from this cup yesterday evening." Dr. Haydock said, "Yesterday evening?" Miss Marple said, "The grass beneath is damp from dew, but the spill mark is dry. The cup has been here many hours." Dr. Haydock stared at her. He said, "You would make an excellent physician, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She said, "I simply observe, Doctor. Gardens teach patience and attention." They walked together toward the village. The morning remained grey and cold. Cherry blossoms continued falling, indifferent to human drama. Miss Marple thought about bitter almonds and teacups. She thought about relieved expressions and clenched fists. Death arrived in many forms. Natural death came with peace. Murder came wearing masks. Miss Marple had seen both. She recognized the difference. She said, "Doctor, when will the autopsy results arrive?" Dr. Haydock said 2 or 3 days. "The county examiner is thorough," Miss Marple said. "Truth takes time but always arrives eventually." Dr. Haydock looked at her curiously. He said, "You suspect foul play?" Miss Marple said, "I suspect nothing yet. But I remember many things, and remembering helps one recognize patterns." They reached Miss Marple's cottage. Dr. Haydock tipped his hat. She thanked him and went inside. Mary had prepared breakfast, but Miss Marple had little appetite. She sat in her parlour with cold tea. She thought about yesterday's garden party. She thought about trembling hands and telegrams. She thought about medicine purchased for a healthy man. Chapter 3. 2 days passed in subdued quiet. The village waited for autopsy results. Clara remained at the Ashford house, receiving condolence visits. She played the grieving niece with admirable consistency. Miss Marple maintained her usual routines. She tended her garden, attended church services, and listened to village gossip. Information flowed through St. Mary Mead like water through a streambed, following predictable channels. On the third morning, a sleek black motor car arrived. It pulled up to the Ashford house with expensive smoothness. 2 men emerged wearing London suits and serious expressions. Mary reported this development while serving lunch. She said, "City gentleman to see Miss Clara, very proper looking." Miss Marple buttered her scone. She said, "Business associates, perhaps?" Mary said, "Cook says they are lawyers or bankers." Something about investments. Miss Marple decided a neighbourly visit was appropriate. She prepared a basket of preserves and walked to the Ashford house. The front door stood open to admit spring air. Voices drifted from the study. Clara's voice rose sharply. She said, "You cannot expect payment now. My uncle just died." A man's voice replied smoothly. He said, "Our condolences, Miss Ashford. However, debts do not observe mourning periods." Miss Marple knocked gently. A maid answered, looking harried. Miss Marple presented her basket. She said, "Preserves for Miss Clara, to help during this difficult time." The maid accepted gratefully. She said, "How kind." "Miss Clara is occupied with visitors," Miss Marple said. "Of course, I shall not intrude. Please give her my regards." She turned to leave, but paused, listening. The study door stood slightly ajar. Voices carried clearly through the gap. Another man spoke. He said, "We showed considerable patience." "Your father's estate should have covered these obligations," Clara said. "Father's estate was encumbered." "You know this?" the smooth voice said, "which is why we extended credit." "But £10,000 is substantial, Miss Ashford." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. £10,000 represented an enormous sum. Few people in St. Mary Mead saw that much money in a lifetime. Clara said desperately, "Give me time. The Colonel's estate will pass to me. I can repay everything." The second man laughed without humour. He said, "If the estate to you." "Wills can be complicated." Miss Marple moved away from the door. She walked slowly down the drive. Her mind worked through calculations. £10,000 in debt. An uncle who refused further assistance. A convenient death. She encountered Dr. Haydock near the village green. He carried his medical bag and wore a troubled expression. He tipped his hat. She said, "Good afternoon, Doctor. You look concerned." Dr. Haydock glanced around. He said, "The autopsy results arrived. Can we speak privately?" They walked to Miss Marple's cottage. Mary served tea in the parlour. Dr. Haydock waited until she departed before speaking. He said, "Poison. Cyanide specifically. Administered in liquid form." Miss Marple set down her teacup. She said, "You were correct about the bitter almonds." Dr. Haydock said, "The amount was significant but not immediately fatal. The Colonel likely felt ill, went outside for air, and collapsed." Miss Marple said, "The teacup beneath the cherry tree." Dr. Haydock nodded. He said, "Inspector Slack has taken it as evidence. We await analysis of any residue." Miss Marple poured more tea. She said, "Has Clara been informed?" Dr. Haydock said, "Not yet. Inspector Slack wants to question her first." "He is taking this seriously now," Miss Marple said, "as he should." "Murder is rather serious." Dr. Haydock leaned forward. He said, "Tell me truthfully, Miss Marple. Do you suspect Clara?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. She said, "I suspect desperation, Doctor." "Desperate people do terrible things," Dr. Haydock said, "but Clara seemed genuinely fond of her uncle." Miss Marple said, "Fondness and need often conflict. When need becomes desperate enough, fondness loses the battle." She told him about the London visitors and the overheard conversation. Dr. Haydock's expression grew darker as she spoke. He said, £10,000. "Good Lord," Miss Marple said, "gambling debts, I suspect. They have a way of accumulating rapidly." Dr. Haydock said, "But surely there were other solutions." "Bankruptcy, employment, economizing." Miss Marple said, "Pride prevents many solutions, Doctor, and impatience prevents others." Clara wanted immediate relief. They sat in silence. The parlour clock ticked steadily. Outside, birds sang without concern for human troubles. Miss Marple thought about a housemaid she knew decades ago. The girl poisoned her employer for a mere £100 and a silver tea service, she said. Greed wears many disguises. Sometimes it appears as necessity, sometimes as justice. But underneath, it remains simply greed. Dr. Haydock said, "What should I tell Inspector Slack?" Miss Marple said, "Tell him everything. About the medicine Clara purchased, about her financial situation, about the teacup." Dr. Haydock stood reluctantly. He said, "This will destroy her life," Miss Marple said gently. "She destroyed her own life, Doctor." "And her uncle's. We merely reveal what already exists." Dr. Haydock departed. Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. She picked up her knitting. The repetitive motion soothed her mind. Knit 1, purl 2. Simple patterns creating complex results. Evening approached. Miss Marple watched shadows lengthen across her garden. She thought about Clara's trembling hands at the garden party. She thought about the Colonel's distress over the telegram. She wondered if the Colonel suspected his danger. Old soldiers developed instincts for threats, but family represented the blindest spot. People rarely suspected those who called them uncle or cousin or friend. Mary brought supper on a tray. She said, "The village is buzzing with news. They say the Colonel was murdered." Miss Marple said, "Sadly true," Mary said. "Who would do such a thing?" "The Colonel harmed no one," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes the victim's innocence makes no difference. The murderer's need matters more than the victim's character." Mary shivered. She said, "It makes one afraid." "If someone like the Colonel can be killed, anyone could be," Miss Marple said. "Fear is natural, but rarely productive. Caution and observation serve better." Mary cleared the tea things and departed. Miss Marple remained in her chair. Darkness fell completely. Stars emerged one by one. The village settled into night. She thought about the London men in their expensive suits. They represented pressure, deadline, consequence. Clara stood between them and destitution. The Colonel stood between Clara and inheritance. Miss Marple understood the mathematics of desperation. She had seen it play out across decades. A person reached a point where no acceptable solutions remained. Then they chose from unacceptable ones. Clara chose poison. Quick, relatively painless, easily disguised as natural death. She possessed chemistry knowledge from finishing school. She had access to her uncle's food and drink. She had motivation measured in £10,000. The pieces fit together like sections of a quilt. Miss Marple could see the pattern clearly now. Inspector Slack would need evidence, testimony, proof. She would help him find it. Not from spite or satisfaction. Simply because truth mattered. Colonel Ashford deserved justice. Clara deserved consequences. The living deserved to know that actions carried weight. Chapter 4. The vicarage hosted a memorial gathering 3 days after the autopsy results. Villagers arrived carrying flowers and sympathy. They spoke in hushed tones about the Colonel's sudden death and the shocking revelation of poison. Reverend Leonard Clement greeted guests with practiced solemnity. His wife Griselda managed the practical details. She arranged chairs and directed the flow of tea and sandwiches. Her cheerful nature remained subdued for the occasion. Miss Marple arrived carrying a bouquet of early roses. She wore black, though not deep mourning. She had not been family. The vicar thanked her warmly. He said, "Your presence comforts everyone, Miss Marple." She settled into a chair near the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass. April weather remained unpredictable. Sunshine and storms alternated without warning. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived in dramatic fashion. She wore elaborate black crepe and carried a handkerchief. She dabbed at dry eyes. She said loudly, "Such a tragedy. And to think murder in our village." Griselda offered tea. She said, "Please, Mrs. Price Ridley, do not distress yourself." Mrs. Price Ridley accepted the cup. She said, "I saw Clara and the Colonel arguing just the day before he died." The room quieted. Everyone turned toward her. Mrs. Price Ridley enjoyed attention. She continued with relish. She said, "I was passing the Ashford house." Their voices carried through the open windows. Clara demanded money. The Colonel refused. She said terrible things, Miss Marple asked gently. "What manner of things?" Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. She said she told him he was cruel and selfish. She said he would regret his stubbornness. Someone gasped. Reverend Clement said, "Perhaps we should not speculate about private family matters." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. She said, "Murder is hardly a private matter, Vicar." Young Lettice Prothero spoke up from her corner. She said, "I saw someone else that morning." All eyes shifted to her. Lettice was 16 and usually invisible in adult gatherings. She blushed under the attention. She said, "A stranger." Walking near the Ashford property just after dawn, Dr. Haydock asked, "Can you describe this person?" Lettice thought carefully. She said, "Tall, wearing a dark coat." "I could not see the face clearly in the dim light," Miss Marple said. "What time was this, dear?" Lettice said, 5:30. "I was returning from an early walk." Miss Marple filed this information carefully. A stranger at dawn suggested premeditation or perhaps a conspirator. Though poison typically required close access to the victim, Griselda brought fresh tea to Miss Marple. She sat down beside her. She said quietly, "This must trouble you greatly." Miss Marple said, "Death always troubles me, especially unnecessary death," Griselda said. "Clara ordered medicine from Mr. Parminter last week. Something for the heart." But the Colonel had no heart condition. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She said, "Are you certain?" Griselda nodded. She said Mr. Parminter mentioned it to Leonard. He thought it odd, but assumed Dr. Haydock prescribed it. Miss Marple said, "Did he describe the medicine?" Griselda said, "Something with digitalis and other compounds." Quite specific. Miss Marple knew digitalis came from foxglove plants. In proper doses it strengthened weak hearts. In improper doses it could kill. Combined with other substances, it might mask or mimic poison. The gathering continued for another hour. Villagers shared memories of the Colonel. He had been generous and kind. He supported the church and local charities. He helped young men find employment. His death diminished the community. Miss Marple listened to each story. She built a picture of a man who deserved long life and peaceful death. Instead, he received betrayal and poison. The injustice of it settled heavily in the room. Inspector Slack arrived near the gathering's end. He nodded to the vicar and approached Miss Marple. He said, "A word, please." They moved to the vicar's study. Inspector Slack closed the door. He looked less skeptical than usual. He said the teacup contained cyanide residue. "Significant amounts," Miss Marple said. "So the poison was administered in Clara's cup." Inspector Slack said, "The cup belongs to her, yes. But we must prove she gave it to the Colonel," Miss Marple said. "Have you questioned the household staff?" Inspector Slack nodded. He said, "The cook saw Clara preparing a tea tray that evening. She took it to the Colonel in his study. The cook assumed it was a gesture of reconciliation after their argument." Miss Marple said, "Did the Colonel drink from the cup in the study?" Inspector Slack said, "The cook heard them talking." Then Clara returned with the empty tray. She washed the cups herself, which was unusual. Miss Marple said, "Destroying evidence." Inspector Slack said, "Or simply being helpful. Without witnesses, we cannot prove she poisoned the tea." Miss Marple considered this. She said, "What about the chemist's records?" Inspector Slack said, Clara purchased compounds that could produce cyanide if combined properly. Mr. Parminter kept detailed records. But she claimed they were for her uncle's medical needs, Miss Marple said. Needs he did not have, Inspector Slack said. Precisely. Dr. Haydock confirmed the Colonel had no heart condition and prescribed no medicine, Miss Marple said. So Clara lied about the medicine's purpose. Inspector Slack said, yes, but lying is not proof of murder. We need more. Miss Marple thought about patterns and human nature. She said, Inspector, has anyone examined the Colonel's recent correspondence? Inspector Slack said, we found the telegram that arrived at the garden party. It came from his solicitor in London. Apparently the Colonel intended to revise his will, Miss Marple said, removing Clara as beneficiary. Inspector Slack said, the telegram suggested as much. The solicitor wanted to confirm before drafting changes. Miss Marple said, so Clara knew she was about to be disinherited. She knew her creditors were demanding payment. She needed the Colonel dead before he could change his will. Inspector Slack said, that is our theory, but we need evidence linking her directly to the poison and its administration. Miss Marple said, the household staff may have seen more than they realize. Sometimes servants notice details without recognizing their importance. Inspector Slack said, will you help me question them? You have a way of putting people at ease, Miss Marple agreed. They arranged to visit the Ashford house the following morning. Inspector Slack departed. Miss Marple remained in the study, thinking. Rain continued falling outside. The sky hung low and grey. Weather matched the village mood. Miss Marple thought about Clara's finishing school education. Chemistry was often taught to young ladies disguised as practical household knowledge. She thought about desperation pushing someone past moral boundaries. She remembered a case involving a nurse who poisoned 3 patients before being caught. The nurse had seemed pleasant and caring. Evil often wore attractive masks. Reverend Clement entered the study. He said, you are helping Inspector Slack. Miss Marple said, simply answering questions, Vicar. Reverend Clement said, this troubles me greatly. Clara attended services here. She seemed devout. Miss Marple said, faith and action do not always align. People contain contradictions. Reverend Clement said, I must believe in redemption and forgiveness, Miss Marple said, as must we all. But redemption requires acknowledgement of wrong. Clara has not reached that point yet, Reverend Clement nodded sadly. He said, will there be justice? Miss Marple said, if truth prevails, yes, truth has a persistent quality. It emerges eventually. She gathered her things and prepared to leave. Griselda saw her to the door. She said, thank you for coming. Your presence steadies everyone, Miss Marple said. We steady each other in difficult times. That is what communities do. She walked home through the rain. Her umbrella kept her dry but not warm. The damp chill penetrated her coat. She thought about cherry blossoms falling, their beauty temporary and fragile. Human life shared that fragility. One moment of violence erased decades of living. Colonel Ashford would plant no more gardens. He would host no more parties. Clara's greed had stolen all his remaining years. Chapter 5. Morning arrived with weak sunshine. Miss Marple dressed carefully and walked to the village centre. She passed the bakery, the post office, and the greengrocer. She reached Mr. Parminter's chemist's shop just as he opened. The shop smelled of camphor and dried herbs. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding neat rows of bottles. Labels identified contents in precise handwriting. Everything spoke of order and method. Mr. Edmund Parminter looked up from his counter. He was a thin man with spectacles and careful movements. He said, good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you? Miss Marple said, I need something for headaches. They have troubled me lately. Mr. Parminter selected a bottle from the shelf. He said, this should help. Take 1 powder with water as needed. Miss Marple accepted the packet. She said, thank you. Such a terrible business about Colonel Ashford. Mr. Parminter's expression clouded. He said, indeed. Very terrible, Miss Marple said. I understand Clara purchased medicine from you recently. Mr. Parminter hesitated. He said, I should not discuss customer transactions. Miss Marple said gently, of course not. Professional discretion is admirable. "But the inspector may have questions," Mr. Parminter sighed. He said yes, he has already visited. Clara ordered compounds for her uncle's heart condition, Miss Marple said. But the Colonel had no heart condition. Mr. Parminter looked uncomfortable. He said, "I assume Dr. Haydock prescribed them." I should have confirmed. His young assistant Mary entered from the back room. She carried a crate of new inventory. She said cheerfully, "Good morning, Miss Marple." Miss Marple greeted her warmly. She said, "You must be very busy here." Mary set down the crate. She said, "Always busy. And everyone wants to talk about the murder." Mr. Parminter frowned. He said, "Mary, please show discretion." Mary shrugged. She said, "Everyone already knows. Clara came in 3 times last week. She asked questions about different medicines." Miss Marple said, "What kind of questions?" Mary said, "About mixing compounds, about doses, about how quickly medicines take effect." Mr. Parminter said sharply, "That is enough, Mary." But Mary continued. She said she seemed very interested in heart medicines. She said her uncle needed them urgently. Miss Marple said, "Did she seem knowledgeable about chemistry?" Mary nodded. She said, "Very knowledgeable. She used proper terms. She knew what she wanted." Mr. Parminter looked distressed. He said, "I should have been more careful." "But she seemed genuinely concerned for her uncle." Miss Marple said, "You are not responsible for her deception, Mr. Parminter," he said, "but I provided the means. If I had questioned her more carefully, the Colonel might still live." Miss Marple said, "Determined people find means regardless of obstacles. You acted in good faith." She thanked him and departed. She walked slowly through the village. Her mind worked through the new information. Clara had visited the chemist multiple times. She asked specific questions. She possessed chemistry knowledge. Miss Marple returned home to find Dr. Haydock waiting in her parlour. Mary had admitted him and provided tea. He stood when Miss Marple entered. He said, "I hope I am not intruding." Miss Marple said, "Not at all, Doctor." "You are always welcome." They sat together. Dr. Haydock looked tired. He said, "Inspector Slack wants me to testify about the autopsy findings." "I dread it," Miss Marple said. "Truth requires courage, but you possess that quality." Dr. Haydock said, "Clara will be arrested soon." "The evidence accumulates against her," Miss Marple said, "as it should when someone commits murder." Dr. Haydock said, "Part of me still cannot believe it. She seemed so pleasant and refined." Miss Marple said, "Murderers rarely announce themselves, Doctor. They blend into ordinary life until the necessity forces them to act." Dr. Haydock said, "You have seen many such cases." Miss Marple said, "Human nature repeats itself endlessly. The details change, but the patterns remain constant." She told him about her visit to the chemist. Dr. Haydock listened with growing concern. He said so she researched and planned carefully. Miss Marple said, "Premeditation? Yes. This was not an impulsive act. She considered methods, timing, and consequences," Dr. Haydock said, "except she did not consider being caught." Miss Marple said, "Criminals rarely do. They focus on the goal and ignore the risks. They believe themselves cleverer than they are." Dr. Haydock said, "What specific compounds did she purchase?" Miss Marple said, "Mr. Parminter mentioned digitalis and several others. Combined properly, they might produce or mask cyanide effects." Dr. Haydock said, "Digitalis from foxglove, cyanide from bitter almonds or certain chemical reactions. Someone with chemistry training could manage it." Miss Marple said, "Clara had finishing school education. Such schools taught practical chemistry." Dr. Haydock said, "For household purposes like cleaning and cooking." Miss Marple said, "And occasionally for darker purposes. Knowledge itself is neutral. Application determines morality." They sat in silence. The parlour clock ticked steadily. Outside, village life continued. People shopped and gossiped. Children played. The world kept turning despite tragedy. Dr. Haydock said, "When will Inspector Slack arrest her?" Miss Marple said, "Soon, I expect. He is gathering final evidence. He wants certainty before acting." Dr. Haydock said, "The village will talk for years about this." Miss Marple said, "Villages always talk. Memory fades slowly in small communities." Dr. Haydock stood to leave. He said, "Thank you for listening, Miss Marple." Your perspective helps, Miss Marple said. We all need perspective in dark times. Murder disturbs everyone's sense of safety. After he departed, Miss Marple sat with her knitting. She thought about Clara's careful research. She thought about trips to the chemist and questions about compounds. She thought about finishing school education turned toward murder. Education served many purposes. It elevated, enlightened, and empowered. But power without morality became dangerous. Clara possessed knowledge and need. She lacked the moral strength to resist temptation. Miss Marple remembered a governess who poisoned her employer's children. The governess wanted the husband for herself. She studied toxicology in secret. She administered poison slowly over months. Eventually, someone noticed the pattern. Patterns revealed truth. Miss Marple specialized in recognizing patterns. She saw Clara's desperation at the garden party. She saw relief after the Colonel's death. She saw the mathematics of inheritance and debt. Now she saw the final pieces falling into place. The chemist's records, the household staff's testimony, the autopsy results. Everything pointed toward Clara. The evidence formed a clear picture. Inspector Slack would arrest her. The trial would proceed. Justice would prevail. Miss Marple felt sadness but no doubt. Clara had chosen her path. Consequences would follow. Evening approached. Mary served supper. Miss Marple ate little. Her mind remained occupied with darker thoughts. She wondered if Clara felt guilt or only fear of capture. She wondered if Clara regretted her actions or only their discovery. Guilt required conscience. Fear required only self-interest. Miss Marple suspected Clara possessed more fear than guilt. She had watched the woman's performance at the memorial gathering. The grief seemed rehearsed, the sorrow shallow. True remorse would come later, perhaps in prison, or perhaps never. Some people never reached genuine regret. They remained focused on their own suffering, never acknowledging the suffering they caused. Colonel Ashford would never see another spring. He would never walk beneath his cherry trees. Clara had stolen his future for money. The exchange seemed impossibly cruel. Miss Marple finished her tea and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring more developments. Inspector Slack would question the household staff. Evidence would accumulate. The net would tighten around Clara. Chapter 6. Rain returned during the night. Morning arrived grey and damp. Miss Marple woke to water streaming down her windows. She dressed and went downstairs. Mary had already started the fire. Miss Marple ate breakfast slowly. She read the newspaper but absorbed little. Her mind remained occupied with the investigation. Inspector Slack would visit the Ashford house today. She had agreed to accompany him. A knock sounded at the door. Mary answered and returned with Dr. Haydock. He looked troubled, his coat dripping rain. He said, "I apologize for the early intrusion." Miss Marple said, "Come in, doctor." "Sit by the fire," Dr. Haydock accepted gratefully. He warmed his hands. He said, "I have wrestled with my conscience all night." Miss Marple waited patiently. She knew confession took time. People needed to approach truth at their own pace. Dr. Haydock said, "The Colonel consulted me 2 weeks ago. He asked about symptoms of poisoning." He seemed worried. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She said, "What did you tell him?" Dr. Haydock said, "I asked why he was concerned. He said Clara had been acting strangely. She asked questions about his health. She insisted on preparing his food and drinks." Miss Marple said, "He suspected danger?" Dr. Haydock said, "Perhaps. He asked me to examine him thoroughly. I found nothing wrong." "I told him he was perfectly healthy," Miss Marple said. "Did you share his concerns?" Dr. Haydock looked ashamed. He said, "I dismissed them. I thought he was being paranoid." He was elderly. "I assumed he was imagining threats," Miss Marple said gently. "You could not have known," Dr. Haydock said, "but I should have listened more carefully." "He trusted me with his worry. I failed him," Miss Marple said. "You acted according to your medical judgment. Clara deceived everyone, not only you. Dr. Haydock said I should tell Inspector Slack about this conversation. It shows the Colonel suspected Clara." Miss Marple said, "Yes, you should. It establishes her opportunity and his awareness of danger." Dr. Haydock said, but it also reveals my failure." "I will look incompetent," Miss Marple said. "You will look honest." "That matters more than pride." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. He said, "You're right, of course. Professional reputation means nothing compared to justice." Miss Marple said, "The Colonel came to you because he trusted you. Honor that trust by speaking truthfully now." Dr. Haydock stood. He said, "I will speak with Inspector Slack immediately." "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "Courage comes in many forms, Doctor. Speaking difficult truth is among the hardest." After he departed, Miss Marple sat thinking. The Colonel had suspected danger. He sought medical advice. But suspicion alone could not protect him. Clara moved first. Mid-morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's door. He arrived in an official motor car. He said, "Ready to visit the Ashford house." Miss Marple gathered her coat and umbrella. They drove through the rain. The village looked drab and colourless. Spring's early promise had given way to grey reality. They arrived at the Ashford house. Clara answered the door herself. She looked pale but composed. She said, "Inspector." "Miss Marple, please come in." They entered the drawing room. Clara offered tea. Inspector Slack declined. He said, "We have questions about your uncle's death." Clara sat carefully. She said, "Of course." "I want to help however I can," Inspector Slack said. "You purchased medicine from Mr. Parminter. Can you explain why?" Clara said, "Uncle Edward complained of chest pains. I wanted to help him." Inspector Slack said, "Dr. Haydock says the Colonel had no heart condition." Clara said, "Perhaps Uncle Edward did not mention it." "He was proud about such things," Miss Marple said gently. "But the medicine you purchased was not typical for heart conditions. The compounds suggest different purposes." Clara's composure slipped. She said, "I do not understand chemistry. I asked Mr. Parminter for help." Inspector Slack said, "His assistant says you asked very specific questions." "You demonstrated considerable knowledge," Clara said. "I attended finishing school. We learned basic chemistry." Inspector Slack said, "Basic chemistry does not typically cover cyanide production." Clara stood abruptly. She said, "I didn't poison my uncle." "Why would I?" Miss Marple said, £10,000 in gambling debts, an uncle refusing further assistance, an inheritance about to be removed." Clara stared at her. She said, "How dare you?" "My uncle loved me," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps he did, but he loved principle more. He would not enable your reckless behavior." Inspector Slack said, "We have the telegram from his solicitor. He intended to change his will." "You would have received nothing," Clara said. "That is speculation." "He mentioned no such thing to me," Inspector Slack said, "because he knew you would react badly. He planned to inform you after the legal changes were complete." Clara said, "I want a solicitor present." "I will answer no more questions," Inspector Slack said. "That is your right. But we have sufficient evidence to hold you for further investigation." Clara's face went white. She said, "You cannot arrest me. I am innocent." Inspector Slack said, "You had motive, means, and opportunity. You researched poison. You purchased compounds. You administered them in tea using your own cup." Clara said desperately, "Prove it." "You cannot prove any of this," Miss Marple said. "The household staff saw you prepare the tea tray. They saw you wash the cups yourself afterward, which was unusual. They heard you argue with your uncle about money," Clara said. "Servants gossip and exaggerate." Inspector Slack said, "Dr. Haydock will testify that the Colonel suspected you. He consulted the doctor about poisoning symptoms 2 weeks before his death." Clara sank back into her chair. Her composure shattered completely. She said nothing, staring at her hands. Inspector Slack said, "Clara Ashford, I am arresting you on suspicion of murdering Colonel Edward Ashford. You will be held pending formal charges." Clara began crying, not the gentle tears of grief, but harsh sobs of fear. She said, "I did not mean to kill him. I only wanted him to become ill." "I wanted time to find another solution," Inspector Slack said, "but you did kill him." "The dose was fatal," Clara said. "I miscalculated." "I am not a chemist. I studied it years ago." "I thought a small amount would only make him sick," Miss Marple said. "You wanted him incapacitated so you could manage his affairs. You wanted access to his money before the will changed." Clara nodded through tears. She said, "The creditors were threatening me. I was desperate. I thought if Uncle Edward fell ill, I could care for him. I could convince him to help me one more time. Inspector Slack said, "Instead, you murdered him." Clara said, "It was an accident." "A terrible accident," Miss Marple said. "Accident suggests no intent. You researched poison. You purchased compounds. You prepared the tea." Each step required deliberate choice. Clara had no answer. Inspector Slack called for a constable. Clara was led away in handcuffs. She continued crying, but the tears changed nothing. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack stood in the empty drawing room. Rain continued falling outside. The house felt hollow and cold. Inspector Slack said, "Thank you for your assistance, Miss Marple." "Your observations were invaluable," Miss Marple said. "I simply remembered patterns." "Human nature repeats itself," Inspector Slack said. "Will you testify if needed?" Miss Marple said, "If necessary, yes." "Though I hope her confession suffices," Inspector Slack said. "It likely will. The evidence combined with admission should secure conviction." They departed. Inspector Slack drove Miss Marple home. She thanked him and went inside. Mary greeted her with hot tea and worried questions. Miss Marple answered briefly, then retreated to her parlour. She sat by the window watching rain fall. She felt no satisfaction in Clara's arrest. Justice was necessary but brought no joy. A man was dead. A woman faced prison. 2 lives destroyed by greed and desperation. Chapter 7. 2 days passed, while Clara remained in custody. The village buzzed with gossip and speculation. Some defended her. Others condemned her. Miss Marple listened but said little. Inspector Slack requested Miss Marple's presence for Clara's formal statement. He believed her calm presence might encourage honesty. Miss Marple agreed reluctantly. She found no pleasure in witnessing confession. They met at the county constabulary. Clara sat in a bare room with her solicitor beside her. She looked diminished, her fine clothes wrinkled, her hair unkempt. Her eyes were red from crying. Inspector Slack began the interview. He said, "Miss Ashford, you previously stated your uncle's death was accidental. Do you maintain that position?" Clara's solicitor said, "My client has prepared a statement. She wishes to provide full disclosure." Clara unfolded a paper with shaking hands. She read in a flat voice. She said, "I killed my uncle, Colonel Edward Ashford. I did so deliberately, though I regret it deeply." Inspector Slack said, "Please explain your actions." Clara said, "I accumulated debts in London." "Gambling debts primarily?" "My creditors demanded payment." "My uncle had helped before but refused further assistance." She paused, struggling with emotion. Her solicitor touched her arm gently. She continued. She said, "I learned Uncle Edward planned to disinherit me. I would receive nothing. My debts would destroy me." Miss Marple listened quietly. Clara's words confirmed everything she had deduced. Motive, method, opportunity, all aligned. Clara said, "I attended finishing school where we studied chemistry. I remembered lessons about compounds and reactions. I researched further in library books." Inspector Slack said, "You specifically researched poisons?" Clara nodded. She said, "I learned cyanide could be produced from certain combinations. I learned it could mimic heart failure if administered correctly." She wiped her eyes. She said, "I visited Mr. Parminter's shop multiple times. I purchased the necessary compounds. I told him they were for Uncle Edward's health." Inspector Slack said, "But the Colonel was healthy." Clara said, "Yes, I lied. I needed access to the chemicals." She described mixing the compounds in her room. She described testing small amounts to ensure proper reaction. She described her growing certainty that murder offered her only escape. Clara said, "The garden party provided opportunity." Everyone was distracted. "I prepared tea in my personal cup. I added the poison and brought the tray to Uncle Edward's study." Miss Marple asked gently, "Did he suspect?" Clara said, "Perhaps. He looked at me strangely, but he drank the tea. He trusted me despite everything." Inspector Slack said, "What happened next?" Clara said, "I returned the tray to the kitchen. I washed the cups myself." "I wanted to remove evidence," Inspector Slack said, "but you left one cup beneath the cherry tree." Clara looked confused. She said, "I do not understand." "I washed both cups," Miss Marple said. Your uncle must have taken the cup outside. He felt ill and went for air. He collapsed beneath his favorite tree. Clara covered her face. She said, I did not know. I thought he died in his study. I thought someone would find him in the morning. The confession continued for another hour. Clara described her fear when Dr. Haydock ordered an autopsy. She described her terror when Inspector Slack began investigating seriously. She said, I thought I had been clever. I thought no one would suspect. But everyone suspected. Inspector Slack said, murder creates ripples. Those ripples reach everywhere eventually. Clara said, I wanted to confess many times, but fear silenced me. I hoped somehow the truth would remain hidden. Miss Marple said, truth rarely stays hidden. It emerges like spring flowers pushing through frozen ground. Clara looked at her. She said, you knew from the beginning, Miss Marple said. I observed patterns. I remembered similar cases. Human nature follows predictable paths, Clara said. I am not a monster. I loved my uncle. But I needed money desperately, Miss Marple said. Need does not justify murder. Many people face desperate circumstances. Most do not kill, Clara said. What will happen to me? Her solicitor said, you will face trial. Your confession will be considered. But the evidence is overwhelming. Inspector Slack said, you will likely receive a lengthy prison sentence. Possibly life. Clara began crying again. She said, I have destroyed everything. My life, my uncle's life, my family's reputation. Miss Marple said, yes, actions carry consequences. You chose your path. Now you must walk it. The interview concluded. Clara was returned to her cell. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack walked outside. The rain had stopped. Weak sunshine broke through clouds. Inspector Slack said, a sad business entirely. Miss Marple said, murder is always sad. It destroys both victim and perpetrator. Inspector Slack said, will you attend the trial? Miss Marple said, only if required. I have no desire to witness further suffering. Inspector Slack said, your testimony may be unnecessary. The confession provides sufficient basis for conviction. Miss Marple said, good, Clara has admitted her crime. Justice will proceed. They parted. Miss Marple walked home through the damp village. Shopkeepers greeted her. She responded politely, but did not linger. She felt tired and old. She reached her cottage and went inside. Mary had prepared lunch. Miss Marple ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Her mind remained in that bare room where Clara confessed. She thought about desperation pushing someone past moral boundaries. She thought about gambling debts accumulating like storm clouds. She thought about a young woman's chemistry lessons twisted toward murder. Education could elevate or destroy. Money could bless or curse. Family could nurture or suffocate. Everything depended on the human heart receiving these gifts. Clara's heart had been weak, not physically weak like the invented heart condition, morally weak. She lacked the strength to face consequences honestly. She chose murder instead of bankruptcy. She chose poison instead of humility. Miss Marple thought about the Colonel's last moments. Did he understand what was happening? Did he realize his niece had betrayed him? Or did he die confused and afraid, wondering why his body failed? She hoped he died quickly without full understanding. Betrayal by family cut deeper than physical pain. Better to die ignorant than knowing your murderer shared your blood. Evening approached. Miss Marple sat in her parlour with knitting. The needles clicked steadily. Knit 1, purl 2. Simple patterns creating complex results. Life worked similarly. Small choices accumulated into destinies. Clara's small choices built toward murder. A gambling habit here. A debt there. A decision to seek easy money instead of honest work. Each choice seemed minor individually. Together they created catastrophe. Miss Marple understood human weakness. She did not judge harshly. But she believed in accountability. Clara chose her path. Society must respond appropriately. Justice required consequences. Dr. Haydock visited that evening. He looked relieved. He said, "It is finished then," Miss Marple said. "The investigation is finished. The healing will." Longer, Dr. Haydock said, "The village will recover." "We always do," Miss Marple said. Villagers possess remarkable resilience, but individuals carry scars, Dr. Haydock said. You especially. You see so much darkness, Miss Marple said. I see human nature in all its complexity. Darkness exists alongside light. Acknowledging both creates wisdom. Dr. Haydock said, You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. Miss Marple said, I am simply old and observant. Time teaches lessons if one pays attention. They sat together in comfortable silence. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, night settled over St. Mary Mead. Stars emerged one by one. The world continued turning despite tragedy. Chapter 8. Spring deepened into early summer. Cherry blossoms had long since fallen. Green leaves covered the trees in the Ashford garden. The estate remained empty, awaiting legal resolution. Clara's trial proceeded swiftly. Her confession simplified matters. The jury deliberated briefly. They returned a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison. The village discussed the case for several weeks. Then, as always, attention shifted to new concerns. A roof needed repair. A wedding required planning. Life continued its gentle rhythm. Miss Marple resumed her normal routines. She tended her garden. She attended church services. She poured tea for visitors. But something had changed. She felt the weight of her years more acutely. Dr. Haydock visited often. He seemed to need reassurance that he had acted correctly. Miss Marple provided it patiently. She reminded him that truth-telling required courage. He possessed that courage. One afternoon, the vicar and Griselda stopped by with flowers. They found Miss Marple in her garden, pulling weeds among the roses. She wore an old hat and gardening gloves, Griselda said. The garden looks lovely, Miss Marple. Miss Marple straightened slowly. She said gardens require constant attention. Neglect them briefly and weeds take over. Reverend Clement said the same applies to souls, I think, Miss Marple said. Indeed. Moral character requires constant cultivation. They sat together in the garden. Mary brought tea and biscuits. Birds sang in nearby trees. The afternoon felt peaceful and ordinary. Griselda said, Have you heard about the Ashford estate? Miss Marple said, Only that it remains unsold. Reverend Clement said, The Colonel's will left everything to local charities. Clara received nothing even before the murder. Miss Marple said, So her crime gained her nothing? Griselda said, Worse than nothing. She destroyed her life for an inheritance that never existed. Miss Marple said, Greed often blinds people to reality. They see what they want rather than what exists. Reverend Clement said, A tragic waste of 2 lives. Miss Marple said, Yes. The Colonel deserved many more years. Clara deserved the chance to learn from lesser mistakes. They talked of other things. Village gossip, church matters, upcoming events. Gradually the conversation lightened. Laughter replaced solemnity. Life asserted itself over death. After they departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden. She thought about patterns and cycles. Gardens taught patience. They taught that destruction came quickly, but growth required time. Clara destroyed in a single evening the Colonel's life, her own future, her family's reputation. 1 cup of poisoned tea accomplished all that devastation, but rebuilding would take years. The village must heal. The Ashford estate must find new purpose. Clara must somehow find redemption if such was possible. Summer arrived properly. Roses bloomed in brilliant colours. Children played in village lanes. Farmers worked their fields. St. Mary Mead looked beautiful and peaceful. Miss Marple sat in her parlour one afternoon with Dr. Haydock. He had brought a medical journal to show her. It contained an article about poison detection. He thought she might find it interesting. She read carefully. She said, Science advances remarkably. Detection becomes easier each year. Dr. Haydock said, Criminals find it harder to escape justice. Miss Marple said, Though human cleverness should never be underestimated, each advance in detection inspires advances in deception. Dr. Haydock said, You have a cynical view of humanity. Miss Marple said, Not cynical. Realistic? People contain both nobility and selfishness. Circumstances determine which emerges. Dr. Haydock said, "What circumstances led Clara to murder?" Miss Marple said, "Desperation, pride, and lack of moral foundation." She faced crisis without inner strength to resist temptation. Dr. Haydock said, "Could anything have prevented it?" Miss Marple said, "Perhaps, if her parents taught better values, if she faced consequences earlier for smaller transgressions, if the Colonel recognized danger sooner." She set down the journal. She said, "But speculation helps no one. We cannot change the past. We can only learn from it." Dr. Haydock said, "What should we learn from this case?" Miss Marple said, "That evil hides behind pleasant faces, that financial pressure drives desperate acts, that family connection provides no protection from human weakness." Dr. Haydock said, "Grim lessons." Miss Marple said, "True lessons." Villagers like to believe themselves immune to serious crime, but human nature exists everywhere. Class and location provide no immunity. Dr. Haydock said, "You sound tired." Miss Marple said, "I am old. Murder always exhausts me. Not physically, but spiritually." Dr. Haydock said, "Perhaps you should rest more." Miss Marple smiled. She said, "I shall rest eventually, Doctor. For now, observation continues." Villagers provide endless study material. They talked of lighter matters. Dr. Haydock told stories about his patients. Miss Marple shared village gossip. The afternoon passed pleasantly. After he departed, Miss Marple picked up her knitting. She worked on a blanket for the church charity sale. Each stitch required attention. Each row built upon the previous one. She thought about human hearts and their complexity. People were not simply good or evil. They contained multitudes. Circumstances revealed different aspects. Clara possessed kindness alongside selfishness. The Colonel possessed generosity alongside stubbornness. Every person carried contradictions. Understanding required acknowledging all aspects. Miss Marple had spent decades observing human nature. She recognized patterns but avoided simplistic judgments. Life was complicated. People were complicated. Neat categories rarely fit reality. Evening approached. Mary brought supper on a tray. Miss Marple ate in her parlour, watching the sunset through her window. The sky blazed with orange and pink. Beauty persisted despite tragedy. She thought about the cherry blossoms that began this story. They bloomed brilliantly for a brief time. Then they fell and disappeared, but the trees remained. Next spring would bring new blossoms. Life worked similarly. Individual lives ended, but life itself continued. The Colonel died, but St. Mary Mead lived on. Clara went to prison, but the village adapted and moved forward. Miss Marple found comfort in this continuity. Gardens grew, seasons changed, communities endured. Human nature remained constant, but human communities proved resilient. She finished her supper and set the tray aside. She picked up her knitting again. The needles clicked rhythmically. Knit 1, purl 2. Simple actions creating meaningful results. Night fell completely. Stars emerged in the darkening sky. Miss Marple continued knitting by lamplight. Her cat curled beside her chair. The house felt warm and peaceful. She thought about justice and mercy, punishment and redemption. The legal system provided justice. Clara faced consequences for her crime. But mercy remained possible. Perhaps in prison Clara would find genuine remorse. Perhaps she would emerge eventually with a changed heart. Miss Marple believed in human capacity for change. Not everyone changed, but some did. Suffering sometimes taught what comfort could not. Clara faced years of suffering. Perhaps those years would create wisdom. The church bells rang 9 times. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. She prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. The village would continue. She would continue observing and understanding. She paused at her window before closing the curtains. The village lay quiet beneath the stars. Lights glowed in scattered windows. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Everything felt ordinary and peaceful. This was her life and her calling. To observe, to understand, to remember, to recognize patterns and speak truth when necessary, to sit quietly and see what others missed. Murder beneath the cherry blossoms had concluded. Justice had prevailed. Peace had returned. Until the next mystery emerged, as mysteries always did. Human nature guaranteed that. Miss Marple smiled slightly. She closed the curtains and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. She would be ready. Candlelight outro. And so, dear listener, murder beneath the cherry blossoms draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame glows steadily again. Its light rests gently on the revealed truth. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes. Each stitch reflects the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.